Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nat podcast number 2007, Breaking Genealogy Brick Walls, Expert Strategies for a Tough Family History Mystery. Sorry, I don't know where that came from. But we've got Breaking Genealogy Brick Walls, Expert Strategies for Tough Family History Mysteries. Don't ask me where I came up with that one from. There you go. My apologies for being on so late tonight. I kind of got distracted with some TikTok videos, including ones that was talking about songs that were turning 40 this year. And I was sort of like, oh my gosh, that was right in the middle of my favorite decade of music. So yeah, I had to watch that. And then what other ones were in there? Oh, there was some other like TV series that were turning like 50 and all, the top 10 TV series of from the 80 to 81 season. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff in there that sort of brought back memories and sort of thought, I must remember to put that into my story, or must remember to put in there that these were some of my favorite songs. And so looking at the TikTok videos has inspiring me of stories that I can tell about my life so that I can leave that for future generations. And then, of course, today being the 28th of January, it was 39 years ago today that the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up 73 seconds after takeoff. And I suddenly thought, I hadn't totally forgotten about it, but it wasn't at the forefront of my mind. But I happened to see a post about it, and I shared that post on my Facebook page. But I thought about it, I thought, where was I then? And for me, I was in New Zealand at the time. I was in the Royal New Zealand Air Force. I was based at RNZAF Base Wigram, which was in Christchurch. They've now decommissioned the base, and it's now got it's all new housing. And there are still some original buildings from the base that are still there, including the Air Force Museum. So if you ever go down to Christchurch and you find where the Air Force Museum is, that was just inside the gate of the Air Force Base. Like you go through the security gate and there'll be the first left. And it was like right there. You can see this huge building. And it's a really cool museum to go in. And some of my grandmother's stuff is on display from her being in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. So it's a great place to go. Lots of memories in that museum. It's one of my places I'm planning on visiting when I get back to New Zealand. When, I don't know. But when I get back to New Zealand, I will be taking these little trips around New Zealand and bringing you along with me. But anyway, back to the Challenger. So total sidetrack. I'm talking about the Space Shuttle Challenger. My memory of that day was that happened at 11:39 a.m. Eastern Time, which in New Zealand on the 28th of January, 39 years ago. So that'll be what, 1986. Since next year will be the 40th. I can't believe it's been 39 years since that happened. Wow. In New Zealand time, it would have been 5:39 a.m. in the morning on January 29th, because we're 20-something hours ahead, depending which time zone you're in. And so at that time, I had to convert it from Eastern to Mountain time to figure out what time it was for today. But it was 5:39 in the morning. At that time, I used to wake up to the radio coming on with my alarm clock. The radio would come on, have my little alarm clock radio there, and rather than having it go an obnoxious beeping noise, I had the radio come on. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's the news, and it came on at 6 o'clock in the morning. And of course, that was the leading news, and that sat me bolt upright in bed. And I was like, the space shuttle blew up, and I had to listen to it a couple of times for it to finally sink in. When I got up, went off to work that day. Came back that evening, and we were and I was living in barracks at the time, the women's barracks on base at the time. And so I remember going into the lounge that evening to watch the 6 o'clock news and see what footage they had of it, what the story was, had they learned anything more. Because it was still a kind of little surreal. It was sort of like, did that really happen? Did it not? And so I went into the lounge, the TV lounge that we had there at the base, and the women's barracks. The place was packed. I was sitting on the floor with a whole bunch of other women. All the seats were taken. There was standing. By the end of it, people were standing up around the walls. It was like literally all of the women who lived in barracks were in the TV lounge. taking up every space. They were sitting on the tables. We had strong coffee tables back then. They were sitting on the furniture. They were sitting on the chairs, on the couches, on the coffee tables, on the floor, standing against the wall. And we all watched the 6 o'clock. We were all there a couple of minutes before 6, so we wouldn't miss a thing when the 6 o'clock news came on. And we're just sitting there in shock. Now, we had all heard by this stage what had happened. And it kind of hadn't, I don't think it kind of really sunk in at that point, but it wasn't until we saw the video footage of it being replayed on the news at 6 o'clock that evening, because it was the leading headline news, that it actually really kind of sunk in, and we were all in shock about it. And I remember after they went from that news thing to another news article, I couldn't even tell you what the next news article, what the next item was on the news list. I couldn't tell you what it was, what the next news article was. But because I remember we just all sat there in silence, and then we all started talking at once, started talking to the people next to us, people around us, having these conversations going all over the room about this. And eventually, I think we sat there for probably about the next half hour or so, because the news was only half an hour at that point. And once the news finished, we just kind of got up and wandered away with our own thoughts about what was happening and that sort of thing. So my question for you right now about that is, where were you when that happened? How did you find out about the Space Shuttle Challenger blowing up 73 seconds after takeoff? How did you find out about that? I do remember years later, I was walking through Arlington Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. And if you've never been to Arlington Cemetery, it is absolutely incredible. I don't know if I have any relatives in there. I know that my mother-in-law's husband is buried in there, and I believe her sister is also buried there as well with her husband. I think her ashes are there with him. But I know that he got buried there years later when he passed away. But that's the only family connection I know of, and that was through marriage. But it is an incredible place to visit. And I'm busy wandering around there, and I came across, they actually have a memorial there for the Space Shuttle Challenger and the crew on there, and all of their faces are engraved on their memorial. It's very, very moving. The whole cemetery is a very moving place, and to watch the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown, incredible experience. But not far from where the Tombs of the Unknown is where the Space Shuttle Challenger Memorial is. Because I remember watching when I visited the cemetery, I remember watching the changing of the guard, and then looking at my map and seeing that the Space Shuttle Challenger Memorial was not that far away. So I walked over to there and had a look at that, and I don't remember if I took pictures of that or not. I have to go back through my photos and have a look. That was the day before digital cameras, so it would have been on film. But yeah, I remember that day. I also remember visiting the memorial as well. So write the story of what happened. What do you remember about that day? How did you hear about the news? What were your feelings about it? Write that down so that your future generations can make that historical event more personal for them, because of you've written how it was for you going through experiencing what happened, then how you found out. And if you were anybody who worked on the program, or if you had relatives that worked on that space shuttle program, and particularly on the Challenger, or were in flight control when all of that happened, if those people are still around in your life, ask them questions about that day. Have them write down if they haven't already, ask them if they would be willing to write down their memories for that day and preserve that for future generations. What was it, if they were in flight control, what was it like in there when that happened? I can only imagine what was going on there. Like, there probably would have been a few moments of total shock of what they had just seen, and then chaos broke out. That's my imagination as to what may have happened in flight control. I don't know. But if you are somebody who worked in flight control on that day, or if you are related to somebody, get them to write these family stories down so they have them for future generations. But yes, so I had a moment of silence earlier today for those that were lost on board the shuttle. Also had a moment of silence too for those that were involved in the entire program. Because goodness knows what thoughts were racing through their head once they realized what had happened, even before all investigations and everything started. So, yeah, that's that. Next, we're going to talk about breaking genealogy. Talk about tonight's topic, breaking genealogy brick walls. We're going to talk about some strategies for tough family history mysteries. I like history mysteries. So my question for you tonight is, what's one ancestor you've been struggling to trace? Think about it, because by the end of this episode, we may give you some strategies to help you move forward. But let's start with these frustrating dead ends happen, and why these frustrating dead ends happen in the first place. Here are some common reasons: misspelling or name changes. Ancestors weren't always recorded the same way. Clerks or whoever was recording that information at the time, it could have been somebody in the church, in the parish. It could have been somebody who was an enumerator. It was whoever was writing down the name at the time may have made spelling errors because they were hearing one thing and spelling it. They were hearing it a different way to what you were saying it, and so they wrote it how they heard it or what they thought it was. Especially if you've got immigrants who had thick accents and didn't know how to spell in English or how to spell their name, then the person writing the name down on the information may have had to, if they didn't have any documents with them, especially if you're like doing census, the enumerators doing the census, they would have written it how they heard it and how they thought it should be spelt. Immigrants, after they arrived in the United States, may have, or whatever country they were going to, may have changed their name and made it more anglicized. So it sounded more American, sounded more Australian, sounded more New Zealand-like or English-like, depending on where they went. And people changed their names for personal reasons. I can tell you, my husband's family, when they first came to the US, they were Abramsovich. And after they arrived in the US, they then changed it to Abrams, which was Abrams. And then when my father-in-law was around the age of 5 or 6, his dad changed it to Brahms, Brahms. So that was just, he wanted to get it, I don't know. Don't know what his reasoning was behind it. I don't know his reasoning behind it, but he decided to change it from Abrams to Brahms. And that's how my husband ended up with the last name Brahms. Another way, and so keep checking on those things. People change their names for personal reasons. You may come across a journal where an ancestor explains why they changed their name. And a lot of people were escaping from religious persecution. So when they got to a different country, they may have changed their name or anglicized it to protect them from being further persecuted because of their religion. And their name at the time would have given away what their religion was, or may have led people to believe that they were of a particular religion and they wanted to protect themselves. So that could be why they anglicized the name as well. Lost or destroyed records, fires, floods, war, poor record keeping mean that some documents simply don't exist anymore. They simply don't. You've got migration and relocation. If an ancestor moved between census or across countries, it can be tough to track them. And there have been instances where you couldn't find, you said, what, they were in the 1910 census, they were living in this area, in this town. They'd been in that town on the 1900 census. They've been there on the 1880 census. We can't do the 1819 census because a lot of that was destroyed in fire. There's a very, very few names that you can see on the 1819 census. And I can't remember which state and counties you have to be part of they had to be part of in order to be seen on the census records for 1890. But if you're in some states like New York, where they had, or California, where they did a state census on the years ending in 5, you may be able to find people, if they were in those areas, on the 1895 or the 1885 census that will help kind of fill in that gap that's been left by the 1890 census. So, you can turn around and say, well, they were on this one, this one, this, and this one. And so where did they go? Well, have a look at history. What was going on during that time that they may have picked up everything and moved across country? Look in newspapers. Here's a good one. Look in the newspapers. There was actually an article on, how was that person related? There was a client I was doing a research on, and we found them in the newspaper. They had a business and they were doing a going out of business sale and there was a newspaper article written about this family. It was written in the late 1800s. It was about this particular family that was related to my client. It was their ancestors. And the newspaper article was written about the fact that they were closing up shop. So they were going to have this closing down sale because they were closing the business because they were moving from Arizona to California. Newspapers back then were huge gossip columns. I kid you not. They had who got admitted to hospital, where they lived, when they got released to hospital, what address they went home to. When they left the hospital, where did they go? Here's the address of the place that they went to. They got, they were admitted into hospital with a broken arm. They're going to be staying there for the next 3 to 5 days. It was interesting to see how long people got stayed in hospital based on their illness or their injury. Like women who gave birth, they were in hospital for 7 days. None of this have birth one day. None of these things are have birth, go home the same day, or give birth and go home the next day. It was 7 days. 7 days. Like, jeepers. Kind of got a little scary there. But, newspapers have a lot of information in there, especially on social stuff. So if people were moving, they may have been selling things. They may have been selling things, or, it would have been written in the newspaper that these people are now after 35 years living here in blah, 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 they are now moving to over here to be closer to where their children have moved, to be close to their grandchildren. And they may give a reason for the relocation. So check newspapers to see if your ancestors were mentioned in their local newspaper of the place that they were living in at the time, and see if there's any mention about them relocating. Also, do a broad search over the country newspapers to see if there's any any little articles, and there'll be just like a little couple of lines, 2 or 3 lines, of people who have moved into the area and where they came from. That's another way that you can find migration and relocation stuff. Women's identities disappearing. Often women weren't listed in official documents or changed their last names after marriage, making them harder to find. Now, on this one, there are rare instances and where the wife does not change her name. The husband changed the name to be the wife's last name. So you will have cases where some men have disappeared because when they got married, they took up their wife's last name. And quite often it's because the wife was the last of that line, and they may have wanted to keep it going on. In the case of, what was the family? The Beretta family, as in the handguns, the Beretta family, who's had that. It's a company that's been around for like 4 centuries or something, for 400 years. There's always been a Beretta at the head of who was the president CEO of the company. It got to the stage where the person who was to inherit it was a daughter. Limiting beliefs and everything at the time, the daughter could not take over because she was not a son, and it was written into the company. I'm trying to remember this. So, I may not be quoting this correctly, but it's one that I remember coming up in research that I did. And for whatever reason, the daughter could not take it over because she was a woman, so it had to go to a male. But she was the last in line, and it had been offered to another male heir, another male family member, but he said, I don't want anything to do with this, don't want anything with family, and he moved to the US, picked up his family and moved them to the US. So there was only this woman left to inherit the company, which of course she couldn't do because of the company guidelines. And so when she got married, the guy that she got married to had to agree to change his name to Beretta so that they could continue the line. And that's what happened. The husband took up the wife's name, and he became a Beretta so he could become the CEO, president of the company. And then their sons then inherited it, and on the line went. So there are cases where you'll still find the wife, you'll still find the woman, but the male may have disappeared because in rare cases, the man had to take up the wife's name. And usually it was in like big companies, these rich families, the well-to-do families, the very business orientated, that it was an arranged marriage of types. And in some instances, the man had to take up the wife's name, and the wife got to keep her maiden name. So check for things like that too, because not only will women's identities disappear, and of course, then they'll be listed in the newspaper as Mr. and Mrs. Frank Roberts. And you're like, well, who's Mrs. Roberts? Or she may be listed in some of the society pages when the women would meet for tea, for afternoon tea, they would have listed Mrs. Frank Roberts, Mrs. Frank Roberts, Mrs. John Jones, Mrs. Peter Smith, and it'll be like, who are these women? So yeah, a lot of times it was like, are these, you come across a name in one of these articles and you're sort of like, is that the person that's in my tree? Or Is it not? So you're going to have to like put that aside, take a note of it, put it aside with a question mark next to it. And then when you're researching and you come across who she got married to, was it that same person? So there are articles out there in newspapers and stuff that will have the identity under the husband's name, like Mrs. Frank Roberts. In the case of, So just be cautious of that. They are out there, but they are very rare. Slavery and historical erasure for African-American genealogy records before 1870 can be difficult to find due to lack of documentation. So that's another reason that you may come across a brick wall. So now we're going to talk about, after a sip of water. Oh, that's nice and cold. We're going to dive into some strategies that can help you uncover your missing ancestors. All right, missing census record problem, where you can't find an ancestor in a specific census year. Try name variations. Search for phonetic spellings, nicknames, or initials. Look at the neighbors. Families often live near relatives. Use state census tax records and city directories as alternatives. If you can't find someone in a census, try looking for their children instead. Sometimes they were recorded differently. So there's another thing for you. And the changed last name mystery. An ancestor seems to have disappeared from the records. Search for name changes due to immigration, marriage, or preference. Use wildcard searches like asterisks or question marks. Asterisk is for several letters, question mark is one letter, to account for spelling variations. DNA testing can confirm relationships and uncover unexpected surname changes. And that's when the matching comes in. So when you're doing the DNA testing, it will prove that you have blood relatives. The genealogy side uncovers how you are related. And when you find those DNA matches, you may end up with somebody who is from that branch that you're looking for. So that maybe help solve the mystery of the last name. Did they change it? Was it spelled incorrectly? Did they change the spelling of it? Did they change the name? You can find it that way. And your expert tip in this one is Ellis Island officials didn't actually change names, but ancestors sometimes adopted easier to pronounce versions after arriving in a new country. Let's see the next section. Sorry, my throat's really dry tonight. The vanished immigration ancestor. No clear immigration or naturalization records. Check multiple ports of entry for your ancestor. May have come through Canada or a different US city. They may have come up through Mexico. They may have come in on a West Coast port instead of an East Coast port. It has happened. Look for their children's records. Sometimes a parent's birthplace is listed. So if you find the birth record of a child of their family, that may have listed on there the mother's maiden name and where they came from. Definitely on death records of children, it'll be listed there as well. If the person who's providing the information knows it, on census reports, if you find the children's records, it will, most of them from what year? I think it was 1850, 1860, that they started recording the birthplace of their parents. And it would even include where the child was born and where their parents were born. Search hometown newspapers for departure and arrival announcements. We just talked about that. The missing maiden name challenge. Can't identify a female ancestor before marriage. Search marriage and death records, children's birth records, and obituaries, because often on those records, the mother's maiden name is listed. Look at land and probate records. Widows often inherited property. Church records sometimes listed maiden names and baptismal records. And again, is it the mother's maiden name that's missing, or is it the fact that the husband changed his name? And like I said, those are very rare circumstances that happened, but they did happen, so just be aware of that. The African-American genealogy brick wall, the 1870 barrier, where no records were before 1870 due to slavery. Research Freedmen's Bureau records, slave schedules, and estate records. Check court documents, plantation records, and Civil War pension files, and use DNA to connect with distant relatives who may have more family history. So that's another good thing about DNA. When you connect with matched people that you're matched to, they may have the key that unlocks everything as well. Okay, so we're also going to talk about some advanced strategies for tough cases. So if you're still stuck after going through all of that, Here are some next level strategies to dig deeper. Cluster research, the FAN method. FAN stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. Your ancestors might appear in records connected to them. They could be appearing on wills as witnesses. They could be on marriage witness records. They could be on land deeds where they have to have witnesses. Look in those places. There may be a neighbor who written a journal that is available online, where you can go in and your ancestors may be mentioned in there. So look through other records, like I said, wills and testaments, to see if they signed, because if you were an heir, or if you were named in the will as being a beneficiary, a benefactor of the will, like an heir, or the person who's going to execute the will, you could not sign as a witness. So you would often call on family members who weren't mentioned in the will, or it may have been neighbors or friends or associates that actually witnessed it for you. DNA testing for breakthroughs. Connect with genetic matches to confirm relationships. Military and church records, draft registrations, pension records, baptismal documents can be gold mines. Absolutely. And on some baptismal records, there may not be a column for it, but the person who was doing the recording at the time may have put in what the birth date of the person was, which is really cool. Land and probate records, wills often list family members not found elsewhere. If you hit an expert tip, if you hit a brick wall, take a step back and research the people around your ancestor, their in-laws, business partners, neighbors. They may hold the key. So let me share a couple of real life examples for you. First case is I had a client who couldn't find her great-grandfather in the 1900 census, but by checking his sister's records, she discovered the whole family had changed their last name after moving states. Yeah, that was a really cool find, that one. In the second case, a client had a dead end tracing their fourth great-grandfather's immigration records, and a deep dive into church documents finally revealed his hometown in Italy. Yeah, the church documents had written had a column in there for place of birth, and so they put his thing there. The other one that you'll find really, really useful too are immigration records when they were applying for naturalization, because on the naturalization application, it had not only it had their name, their date of birth, the applicants, and it was always a male. So it had the husband's name, date of birth, where he was born, so actually the actual town and country. Then it had, if he was married, who was he married to? It had the wife's full name, including her maiden. It had her maiden name on there, when and where they got married, when and where she was born. So you had that information to go. And then if he had any children, their names, their birth dates, and when and where they were born. So the whole family, and it wasn't just him getting naturalized, the whole family was naturalized in those cases. So they had to have everybody's information for the family on file there. So check if you know they came from another country, check for immigration records, for naturalization records, because they are gold mines. Even obituaries can be good gold mines too, because you've got, survived by, and then it'll have all the children. Now, typically on obituaries, if they've had children, they are listed in birth order. And sometimes they will have, for the woman, they may have their married name there. If they're married, they may have the married name. And in parentheses may be the husband's first name. Yes, they're usually listed in birth order. They're usually listed with their spouse. So the child is listed first, followed by their spouse. And the spouse's name, first name may be in parentheses, and then it'll have their last name if they're married. So yeah, I love reading obituaries. I tell you, I love reading obituaries. You can find, some people write these most beautiful obituaries, which have these beautiful stories about the person, about the type of person that they were, how they lived their life, what they contributed to the community, what clubs they belonged to, clubs, societies, associations, even unions that they belong to as well, are all can be listed in the obituaries. Some people go into great detail on them, which is a goldmine, because now they were part of this association, they were part of this volunteer organization, they used to volunteer. go check the records of those places. And now you can start filling in the story as well. So tools and resources to help. Your best databases: Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past, newspapers.com, MyHeritage, newspapers. Oh, what's the other newspaper one? There's newspapers.com, and then there's another one. The newspapers.com is pretty good, but there is another one. Let's see if I can quickly find it. Newspaper Archive. Newspaper Archive have more international newspapers in there than they do American newspapers. So Newspaper Archive is another great resource. You've got local archives with genealogy societies, county courthouses, libraries, history societies, the state, town, or county archives themselves. And then DNA testing, you've got Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, or really, I have done all three. And you're going to go, Helen, why did you do all three? Very simple. The first one I did was actually Family Tree DNA. Got that back. Then I did 23andMe, and the last one I did was Ancestry. And I did these over a 6-month period, I think it was. But I wanted to see what was the difference between the three. And the cool part is because I've done the 3 different types, I actually have a bigger pool of matches that have come in. Excuse me. Some are in more than one, which is pretty cool because if I find them in one, I know how to connect them in the other one. But most of them are all completely different as far as my matches go, because some have done, a lot of them have done Ancestry DNA, some have done 23andMe, and some have done Family Tree DNA. So I can go into any one of those and get connected with my ancestors, and then I go over to my ancestry tree, and I put in there that I am that this person is linked to me through DNA. And when I actually make it a link, because you can automatically do it through the DNA side where you can connect it in the tree. But what I do is I also connect it. I can connect them via DNA on their profile in my ancestry tree, but then I put in their ancestry match from 23andMe or Family Tree DNA. So I will put there where I got where I made the link from, and then on Family Tree DNA I can put the match there, or 23andMe I can put the match there on the trees that I have on those as well. So it's all cross-referenced. And then if you have searched everywhere and still hit a dead end, consider hiring a professional genealogist who specializes in tough cases. I love those. So I have a challenge for you. Pick one ancestor you've struggled to find and try at least one of the techniques we've talked about, and let me know what you discover. And excuse me. And let us know in the comments below how you're getting on with finding information. If you managed to knock down that brick wall, if you're still struggling with it, if you need questions answered or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to us at yourfamilytreedetective.com, and we'll be more than happy to assist you there. And with that, we are out of here. So I hope you found something useful in that. Go out and have a super fantastic sparkling evening, and we will catch you guys back here tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific. I hope. Hang on, let me check my calendar. Oh, yes, it'll be around. Actually, I'm gonna bump it because I do have a call with a very good friend, and we might just talk a little over. So I'm actually going to say 6:30 p.m. tomorrow evening. 6:30 p.m. tomorrow evening Pacific time. Okay, so